Let's begin with understanding what vulnerability means. According to the Declaration of Helsinki, vulnerable people may have an increased likelihood of being wronged or of incurring additional harm. The CIOMS guidelines explain that this implies that vulnerability involves judgments about both the probability and degree of harm, as well as a greater susceptibility to deception or having confidentiality breached. In some cases, people are vulnerable because they are relatively or absolutely incapable of protecting their own interests. This may occur when persons have relative or absolute impairments in decisional capacity, education, resources, strength, or other attributes needed to protect their own interests. In other cases, persons can also be vulnerable because some circumstances in which they live increase the likelihood that others place their interests at risk, whether intentionally or unintentionally. This may happen when people are marginalized, stigmatized, or face social exclusion or prejudice. According to the CIOMS guidelines, vulnerability involves not only the ability to provide initial consent to participate in research, but also aspects of the ongoing participation in research studies. By identifying the circumstances that render individual participants or groups vulnerable, the Research Ethics Committee can heighten its ethical scrutiny of the protocol and review the need for special protection for their rights and welfare. When reviewing, RECs need to be sensitive not to overly exclude people and allow them to participate by requiring that special protections be put in place. CIOMS Guideline 15, Research Involving Vulnerable Persons and Groups, states that when vulnerable individuals and groups are considered for recruitment in research, researchers and RECs must ensure that specific protections are in place to safeguard the rights and welfare of these individuals and groups in the conduct of the research. Special protections for these groups can include allowing no more than minimal risks for procedures that offer no potential individual benefits for participants, supplementing the participants' agreement by the permission of family members, legal guardians, or other appropriate representatives, or requiring that the research be carried out only when it is targeted at conditions that affect these groups. Safeguarding can be designed to promote voluntary decision-making, limit the potential for confidentiality breaches, and otherwise work to protect the interests of those at increased risk of harm. Whereas in the Declaration of Helsinki, under point 19, states that all vulnerable groups and individuals should receive specifically considered protection. As per point 20, medical research with a vulnerable group is only justified if the research is responsive to the health needs or priorities of this group, and the research cannot be carried out in a non-vulnerable group. In addition, this group should stand to benefit from the knowledge, practices, or interventions that result from the research. It is important to highlight that vulnerability is not created solely by the attributes of individuals or groups. Research participants may be vulnerable because of their intrinsic condition, for example, mental incapacitation, or they may be rendered vulnerable by their situation, for example, of poverty, of dependency, or of illness. It is therefore helpful to view not only persons as vulnerable, but also consider vulnerability as a situation. A person who is otherwise a competent adult may become vulnerable in a particular situation. Labeling people as vulnerable can, however, be considered insulting and misleading. Actions seeking to protect vulnerable individuals or groups might be construed as paternalistic and therefore questioned by those for whom protection is sought. Luna F. stated that rather than address the fixed characteristics of individuals and groups that make them vulnerable, a relational understanding of persons and their social environment brings attention to dynamic layers of vulnerability that arise from conditions of economic, social, and political exclusion.